Peter B. Collins, news and comment for August 31st, 2016. It's a Wednesday. Donald Trump has decided to go to Mexico to recharge his tan? No. He went to demonstrate his massive ignorance and his deep racism. And while this was a last-minute addition to his schedule, and later today he is supposed to be giving his definitive immigration speech, I guess using a teleprompter, in Arizona, this visit to Mexico is something that the corporate media is going to play up, and this reflects his showmanship and his effort to establish that he has international credentials and can meet with somebody that he's already demonized. But fundamentally, what's on display is ignorance and racism. And ignorance because Donald Trump uses the immigration problems that the U.S. has had with Mexico as the central focus of what he calls immigration reform. And the problems we have with immigration are not limited to our southern border. And building a wall there, as ridiculous as that sounds, as expensive and ineffective as it would be, even if you could seal off the southern border of the United States, you would not end our immigration issues. Because in recent years, net migration from Mexico has been near zero. And the idea that Mexico would pay for the wall is just a laugh line. Maybe you could try to essentially steal that money from Mexicans who are working in the United States by taxing or grabbing the remittances that they send home to Mexico. But that wouldn't last very long. And so this really is a showcase for ignorance and racism. And Trump, who's trying to soften his message a little bit on immigration by using different words, that's what his campaign team has told us. He still maintains that he's going to build the wall. It's not his central focus in the meeting with Mexican President Peña Nieto. But we are told that he's going to bring it up. And we don't know what else he and Rudy Giuliani and Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, these knuckle-dragging Republicans, I'm not sure what they will have to say in a 50-minute meeting that's what's scheduled with the president of Mexico. But it's all about the optics, right? And so I'm also not sure how Donald Trump plans to use this in his speech in Arizona. Oh, I just came back from Mexico, and we've made a deal. It's a August surprise. And if I get elected president, here are the terms of this excellent deal that I've just negotiated with the president of Mexico. Well, I can't predict. But fundamentally, I don't believe that in the corporate media you're going to hear either of the points I made. Maybe about the racism, because that's really at the core of his campaign. But the ignorance part, no. They won't tell you about that. And, even as he prepared to announce this last-minute trip, he was tweeting with Vicente Fox, the former president of Mexico, who has been very public and very frank, including using the F-bomb on Trump in previous comments. So Trump tweeted, former President Fox, who's railing against my visit to Mexico today, also invited me when he apologized for using the F-bomb. And Fox shot back, no, stop lying. He said he had urged Trump to visit Mexico to apologize for disrespecting the country. Stop lying, Fox shot back. Mexico is not yours to play with. Show some respect. Well, he doesn't have any, so that's not really an option for him. Also, Peña Nieto has said that there is no way Mexico will pay for a border wall, and he has compared Trump's campaign to the rise of Hitler. So that's going to be a very interesting exchange, and it remains to be seen how it will be used by Trump and if it will help him with his campaign. On immigration, there's huge confusion. I'm confused. I don't know what Trump's current positions are on, for example, deporting as many as 11 or 12 million people who don't have citizenship, who are here in the country. And he has given conflicting statements about that in the past week or so. And maybe there'll be some clarity, but knowing Trump, it will probably be leading to more confusion. Well, as predicted, the Senate in Brasilia took its vote today and voted to impeach and remove from office Dilma Rousseff, the first female president of Brazil. And so she is out. The vote was 61-20. It puts an end to 13 years of governing by the Workers' Party and solidifies the oligarchs' control of the temporary administration of Michel Temer, a 75-year-old guy who was the vice president and who is notably more corrupt than Dilma Rousseff. And in Brazil, it's hard to find anyone who doesn't have some taint of corruption. But she was removed from office for a budget play. Maybe it was out of bounds. But it really is hard from here to understand how that has any gravity, any real traction in leading to her removal from office. And the people who orchestrated her removal are also corrupt in the car wash scandal, in various other issues of intrigue and corruption. Temer isn't even allowed to run for re-election because of his own problems, and he has recently been accused of accepting a $300,000 bribe. And my friends in Brazil are actually hoping that the removal of Rousseff is going to stabilize the economy. And frankly, again, from here, I cannot see that. Because by imposing austerity, the already impoverished hordes of people in Brazil will suffer even further, and consumer spending will decline, and unless the cost of the price of crude oil starts to gain momentum and get back up to $80, $100 a barrel, most of these economies, and Brazil's not alone, Russia is affected, Venezuela, they really cannot see a brighter future until the price of crude gets back up to about $100. And so my friends in Brazil, I guess, are hoping just that because there's been gridlock, a paralysis of government since the impeachment started, that this is the only way out. You got to lance that boil and see what happens. Well, it's been lanced, and we will find out how the nation of Brazil will fare during this very turbulent era. And speaking of coups, do you remember the one in Honduras in 2009 when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State? I want to commend the Guardian newspaper from London because its reporter, Nina Lakhani, has done a great job of recapping the events of that time. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. And I learned a few things here. For example, you know about Berta Cáceres, right? She was the activist in Honduras who was killed back in, March of this year? Well, it turns out that she was a likely candidate for vice president back in 2009. And the president at the time, Manuel Zelaya, was trying to get a ballot measure passed to allow his successors to serve more than one term in office. It would not have benefited him. But that was seen as a power grab by his opponents. He was forced out of office, had to leave the country in his pajamas. And when he returned, he took asylum at the Embassy of Brazil. How's that for a little interesting connection here in today's news? And what was going on here in the United States was at the State Department, Hillary Clinton was desperately trying to keep Zelaya from returning to the country before they could have rush elections to ensconce the chosen leader of the United States and other foreign countries. And so the U.S. ties to Honduras have been very significant in this coup that we wouldn't call a coup. And Hillary, in her memoirs, talked about the Honduran coup issue in the hardcover edition of the book, but all of this was deleted when the paperback came out a couple of months ago. And in the book, she said, oh gosh, if we'd called it a coup, it would have triggered other things that actually would have hurt the people of Honduras. Well, I don't particularly believe that. And even if it would have triggered the suspension of U.S. aid, I believe that we've got to stop being the gringo in the picture here and trying to control events in Latin American countries. Now, I don't have any indication that the U.S. was directly involved in this bloodless coup that has removed Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. But the U.S. certainly didn't offer any support, and there has been just this stunning silence from official Washington about the events in Brazil. So I encourage you to read this piece because I did learn, for example, that Zelaya was promoting the candidacy of Berta Cáceres as a vice president on the ticket that would have run in the fall of 2009. And with her death earlier this year, well, the situation in Honduras remains extremely grim. Peter Byrne is an investigative reporter who's been on our podcast several times. He wrote a 10-part series earlier this year about the breast cancer cluster that was falsely attributed to the area where I live, Marin County, California. And now Peter Byrne, who's been freelancing for Fox News, and his latest exposes details about Teneo Holdings. Now, I've heard about Teneo for the last couple of years, and I never understood what the company does, who's involved. I only knew that there was this very strange arrangement that when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and her top assistant, Huma Abedin, was drawing a salary from the State Department, also drawing a salary from the Clinton Foundation, and also earning income from Teneo Holdings. And I find that very unusual. I can't imagine why Huma needs a huge six-figure income at the State Department. She probably made $100,000 or something like that. And we learn that Teneo Holdings is run by Douglas Band, who was President Clinton's longtime aide and was a major official at the Clinton Foundation. Doug Band contacted Huma Abedin repeatedly, trying to arrange appointments with the Secretary of State for people who were big donors to the Clinton Foundation. And many observers think that's just ordinary access in Washington. But Huma Abedin had one boss at the State Department. Hillary Clinton didn't actually sign her paychecks, but she approved her payroll. And then over at the Clinton Foundation, she was being paid by Doug Band, and then she was getting a third payment from Doug Band at Teneo Holdings. And according to Bill Black, a man I deeply respect, he's quoted in this article, and he was the guy who helped us clean up the savings and loan scandal of the 1980s. And Bill Black is quoted, Teneo is a classic example of how the global financial system is rigged. Acting on insider information is critical to the success of its business plan. So what does it do? Well, it brokers valuable securities not available to the public, and it offers intelligence, business intelligence and political intelligence, to people who can afford to pay its fees. And the clients are mostly CEOs of big corporations. And the headquarters has people like Bill Clinton, who got a salary from Teneo as its honorary chairman. Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, has worked there. Former Senator George Mitchell, Ed Rollins, the Republican political consultant, and Ray Odierno, the former United States Army Chief of Staff, is currently on the payroll at Teneo. And so what we're told is that the company provides strategic counsel and helps clients navigate policy debates in Washington and in state capitals. So I'm linking to Peter Byrne's report. I think it's worth knowing about. And we need to know more about Teneo because it is a kind of investment bank. It's only allowed to sell securities to its well-heeled clients, who are considered sophisticated investors. And it does at least create the space for insider trading, where Teneo develops information about, for example, a proposed merger, and its clients can then cash in. Yeah, that's how it works. You scratch my back, I scratch your back, and we'll all see you at the Clinton Global Initiative. Barack Obama is at Lake Tahoe right now, delivering a speech at the annual Lake Tahoe Summit that was started by Bill Clinton when he was president. And he is then winging his way to Asia. At Lake Tahoe, he's just a short chopper ride away from the Black Rock Desert and the Burning Man gathering. But I guess he won't be dropping in this year. Maybe next year when he's got more time on his hands. And the president added another 111 names to his list of people whose prison sentences are being commuted. These are largely nonviolent drug offenders, and I'm glad to see it. Only about another 9,000 to go before he leaves office at the end of January. Every day I like to take a moment to thank the people who support my work at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And let me look at the PayPal list here for recent transactions. Carl Hesterberg, Alice Carlson, Janet Steele set up a new subscription. I'm grateful to you folks for your support. And if you're not a subscriber, it's never too late. You can always just fix that immediately. You come over to peterbcollins.com, and no matter what device you use, what browser you use, there's a menu in the upper right corner. You click on that, and it pulls down. You click on Become a Subscriber. That takes you to the sign-up page where you can choose a level of support that's comfortable for you, $5, $10, $20 a month, the $50 annual subscription. And new annual subscribers qualify for the bonus books that are displayed on the sign-up page. Yesterday, I led the News and Comment podcast with my outrage over the tax scams of Apple Computer. And I explained to you about their double Irish with the Dutch sandwich and how their schemes have worked. And last night, when I flipped on the PBS NewsHour, they covered it. But there was not one word mentioned that Apple avoids taxes in the United States, that it is a tax cheat. It was all narrowed to the focus of this struggle over whether it owes taxes to Ireland as ordered by the European Union. And the hypocrisy abounds in responses to this enforcement action by the European Union. And even the New York Times has noticed this in a business column written by Alan Rappaport. He says that those officials have offered a response viewed by many as rife with hypocrisy, and that response is collective outrage. And we have the U.S. Treasury Department, as we've seen over the last week or two, closing ranks to defend Apple and saying that the Europeans shouldn't be enforcing this. Their ruling was deeply troubling. The Business Roundtable said it was a reckless and dramatic overreach, an act of aggression against Apple Computer. And this really shows the mindset in America today that people can rationalize all kinds of corporate behavior, even when it hurts us, because every dollar that Apple doesn't pay into the U.S. Treasury means that you and I have to cover the cost of the military and all of the obscene spending that our government does, not to speak of the limited amounts of decent spending that our government is responsible for. So it falls to Jack Lew, our Treasury Secretary, to spin this up in a way that's favorable to Apple. And Lew said that the European Commission is using a theory to make tax law, is doing it in a way that is retroactive and that overrides national tax law authority. And, you know, this is just so much Sturm and Drang to protect devious corporate officials who line the pockets of elected officials. And that's what buys their silence. Now we have rare agreement between Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, a Republican, and Chuck Schumer, the New York Democrat, who will likely lead the Democrats in the Senate starting next year. Ryan said this decision is awful, slamming a company with a giant tax bill years after the fact, sends exactly the wrong message to job creators on both sides of the Atlantic. And it sends a message that if you've got good lawyers, you can stretch the rules, violate the rules, make up your own rules, and nothing will happen. The only rational voice quoted in this article is former Democratic Senator Carl Levin of Michigan, who was chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, who looked at Apple's tax havens back in 2013. And Levin said, the royalties Apple collects for its overseas sales of products designed and developed in the U.S. should be taxed in the U.S. But Apple has avoided the billions of dollars of taxes it owes the U.S. by transferring its intellectual property to itself in Ireland. Even that's a little understated, I think. We've told you about the efforts by federal courts to overturn the voter suppression tactics enacted into law by state Republican legislatures. And one of the most egregious cases is North Carolina. And after the Supreme Court overturned the enforcement section of the Voting Rights Act, they went to town with photo IDs, limiting voting polling places, eliminating early voting. And a federal appeals court said that that was surgically targeted to limit the participation of African Americans. But when the appeals court overturned the bad laws, they basically left a vacuum. And now the county-level election commissions are stepping into that void. And what are they doing? They're doing more voter suppression. They're trying to limit early voting. They're trying to limit polling places on college campuses. And they're honest about it that, hey, we're just trying to level the playing field for Republicans because African Americans in North Carolina overwhelmingly vote Democratic. So they're saying they're just, punishing and purging and oppressing Democrats. The fact that they're black, that's just accidental. So it is insidious. And in some of the counties, there are 34 of them, where the local boards of election have not been able to agree on a plan. And if they don't agree on one, the Republican state elections chief gets to compose those plans at the state level. So it's going to be ugly. There's no question about it. And in many states, people of color will have to fight, once again, for the right to vote. Yesterday, we had primaries in Arizona and Florida, and they were disappointing because nothing changed. The incumbent senators, John McCain and Marco Rubio, were able to fend off challengers. On the Democratic side, voters in Florida rejected Alan Grayson by a huge margin. 60% of the voters instead voted for the guy named Patrick Murphy, who was a Republican up until a couple of years ago. He's a wealthy guy. He is a real corporate kind of Democrat. And Alan Grayson is a man with flaws. But as I pointed out in a podcast last week, the allegations leveled against him of domestic violence were political smears timed for this campaign. And while I don't know that he was going to win anyway, it's kind of sad to see him go out in this manner. And the much focused on race between Tim Canova and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, well, it was kind of close. Canova lost by 14 points, and I think he was able to raise something like $4 million for that race to take on the discredited former chair of the Democratic National Committee. But Debbie Wasserman Schultz will return to Congress. And I believe this ends the primary process. Maybe there's one or two left. But so far, only 5 incumbent members of the House of Representatives have been denied re-election in these primaries. And 2 of them lost because they were busy defending themselves from corruption charges. A federal appeals court in New York has thrown out a $655 million verdict that was rendered last year and was holding the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Liberation Organization liable for the damages that were caused by terrorist attacks in Israel that claimed the lives of American citizens. And fundamentally, the court said that while these were awful events that occurred, machine gun attacks and suicide bombings, that American courts don't have the jurisdiction to hear this case. Quote, the federal courts cannot exercise jurisdiction in a civil case beyond the limits prescribed by the Due Process Clause of the Constitution, no matter how horrendous the underlying attacks or morally compelling the plaintiff's claims may be. Now, this arises from the anti-terrorism law that was passed by Congress, and this is another one of those feel-good bits of legislation that's fundamentally unconstitutional. And the idea is that if an American is killed in Israel, that you can sue the Palestinians. And this, of course, is rich in a number of ways, because Israel and the United States don't recognize the Palestinians as a state, and they barely recognize their government entities. And so to assume that for purposes of, going to the United Nations, going to the World Court, or seeking fairness in the world body of public opinion, the Palestinians have no standing. But when it comes to paying off a claim because some Americans were killed in Israel and Palestinians are blamed, suddenly, that's a government, let's soak them. And Kent Yalowitz, a lawyer for the families in the case, said that the Anti-Terrorism Act had been passed by Congress to protect Americans wherever in the world they traveled. Quote, the very terrorists who prompted the law have now hidden behind the U.S. Constitution to avoid responsibility for their crimes. This cruel decision must be corrected so that these families may receive justice. Now, this is just so ridiculous, because terrorists aren't hiding behind the Constitution. Our own courts have found that there was no basis for these lawsuits in the first place. And finally today, a couple of think pieces about the war in the Middle East. Gareth Porter, a longtime friend and contributor to this program, has a new piece out, headlined The Real U.S.-Syria Scandal, Supporting Sectarian War. And in it, he traces some of the history of sectarian tensions in Syria and among its neighbors, going all the way back to the Ottoman Empire era. And he notes that the U.S. policymakers, all the way up to Clinton and Obama, had to know that by unleashing the forces who tried to bring down the government of Bashar al-Assad, that the U.S. was essentially fomenting sectarian violence. And in this quote in the article from Gareth Porter, he writes, the Obama administration bears responsibility for this atrocity because it could have prevented Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia from launching their foolishly adventurous war in Syria. None of them did so out of desperate need. It was a war of choice in every case. And each of the three states is part of the U.S. security system in the Middle East, providing military bases to NATO or to the U.S., and depending on U.S. support for its security. But instead of insisting that those three Sunni allies reconsider their options, the Obama administration gave the green light at a conference in Riyadh at the end of March 2012, that's when Hillary Clinton was still Secretary of State, for proceeding with arming those who wanted to replace the government in Syria, leaving the United States ostensibly free to be the peacemaker. And so I think this is really interesting history that Gareth Porter cites. And he goes on to say, the sectarian extremism expressed both by the Assad government and by the Muslim Brotherhood 30 years earlier was bound to be repeated in the conflict that began in 2011. And he asks, could senior Obama administration officials have been unaware that a war to overthrow Assad would inevitably become an enormous sectarian bloodbath? The administration did nothing to pressure its allies to stop it. In fact, it actually wove its own Syria policy around the externally fueled war by overwhelmingly sectarian forces, and no one in the U.S. political media elite raised the issue. No matter how brutal its rule and its war tactics have been, a war to overthrow the Assad government could only plunge the country into a terrible sectarian bloodbath. And on a similar topic, Murtaza Hussain and Marwan Hishan write at The Intercept that the U.S. has basically, in its new deal with Turkey, has developed a strategy that triggers an entirely new conflict in the region, this time between U.S.-backed militias and Turkey, a NATO ally. Turkey launched its recent incursion both to take territory from the Islamic State and to halt gains by the Syrian Democratic Forces and People's Protection Units, which are Kurdish-led groups backed by the United States. And the anti-Kurd agenda of Turkey certainly dominates. Any issues related to the Islamic State or even the Assad government are secondary to Turkey. And I'm linking to the Intercept piece so you can read it for yourselves. It's got some pretty interesting commentary that I think is worth boning up on. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. You're free to share this with absolutely everyone. Have you? I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling